The Grand Chamber of the Galactic Council had not been so full in 3 centuries. Every species with a seat had sent not merely a delegate but their finest orators, their most decorated diplomats, beings who had spent decades learning the art of controlled language. The chamber's crystal walls refracted the light of 17 solar systems, a deliberate architectural choice meant to remind every attendee that they spoke not for themselves, but for worlds. Ambassador Yara Chen sat at the human table alone. She had not brought aids. She had not brought a speech. She had brought a single glass of water which she had not touched in 4 hours. The session had begun at dawn by the station's artificial clock, and it was now approaching the second meal period. Speaker after speaker had taken the floor. The Mirhan Ascendancy's elder, whose species communicated partly through color shifts in their translucent skin, had flared a deep, mournful violet as he described humanity's history of warfare. Centuries of it, continental, then global, then briefly interplanetary. The Ulari Collective had submitted a 40-page document cataloging every ecological crime committed by the human species across its own homeworld before it had discovered the stars. The Veth Consortium's representative had been more blunt. They are a species that burns things to see what happens. We cannot in good conscience allow such a people to hold equal standing among the civilized. Yara had listened to all of it. She had not taken notes. She had not whispered to neighboring delegates. She had simply watched each speaker the way a person watches weather through a window, present, attentive, without expectation of being able to change it. We do not censure out of hatred. We censure out of responsibility. Some species are simply not ready. When the vote was called, 16 hands, limbs, tendrils, and bioluminescent pulses rose in favor. Yara watched them all. Then she looked down at the table, at the glass of water, and was quiet for a moment that felt much longer than it was. She stood, every eye in the chamber found her, compound, single, clustered, sensory pit, all of them waiting for the explosion, the tears, the dignified legal appeal that would stretch the proceedings another 3 sessions. Humanity's emotions were well documented. Surely this would produce one. Instead, Yara Chen closed the folder in front of her, the folder she had never opened, and said, in a voice that required no translation matrix because its tone was universal, "Very well, we'll see ourselves out." She picked up the glass, drank the water in one slow, complete motion, set the glass back down with a click that echoed in the suddenly silent chamber. Then she walked to the door. She did not look back. The door closed behind her with a sound that was barely a sound at all, just a small mechanical exhale, a whisper of pressure equalization. The council sat in the aftermath of that sound for much longer than anyone later admitted. Something had happened that none of them had prepared for. They had expected grief or rage or negotiation. They had received instead something far more unsettling, a people who heard the verdict and simply decided to leave. The Mirhan elder's skin had gone an uncertain shade between silver and gray, a color that did not appear in any of their standard emotional charts. Later, reviewing the session logs, the council's archivist would simply label it, unclassified response. The first month, the council watched and waited. They had seen species withdraw from proceedings before. The Keth had staged a dramatic exit in the 7th century of the Accord and returned inside a year, terms renegotiated, pride carefully managed. The Solhari had gone silent for 8 months before quietly reapplying for provisional membership. Withdrawal in the council's long experience was a negotiating posture. It was a door left slightly open. It was a held breath before the conversation resumed. Humanity shut the airlock. Within 6 days of Yara Chen's departure, Earth had recalled every diplomat stationed at the Council's 7 hub stations. The recall was not announced. It was simply processed, the way you process a change of address. Human vessels that had been operating as part of joint patrol fleets along the outer rim quietly peeled away from formation without ceremony, without confrontation, without leaving so much as a message buoy. They were there, and then they were not there, and the space they left behind was indistinguishable from space that had never been occupied at all. The shared communications arrays, 17 of them strung between systems like a web of light, went dark on the human end. Not jammed, not sabotaged. Simply turned off the way you turn off a porch light when the guest has gone and you are done waiting. The human merchant vessels stopped answering hails, not with hostility, simply with nothing. The channel opened, the channel stayed open, nothing came through it. By the second month, Council Intelligence Services, a politely maintained fiction of 17 separate agencies who shared roughly 60% of their information, began pooling their observer reports from the remaining non-human presence on Earth's orbital stations. What they described was consistent across all 17 sources, which made it simultaneously more credible and more confusing. Humans were going to work. Not the frantic, reactive work of a species preparing for war. No military buildup, no resource hoarding, no mobilization of fleets. Something quieter and in its own way more alarming. Construction projects of enormous scale in the outer system. Logistics chains being rerouted and reinforced. Universities publishing research at an accelerated rate, papers that had previously been shared through the Galactic Academic Consortium now simply posted to internal human networks and nowhere else. 1,000 small doors, quietly swinging shut. One Ulari observer, a biologist named Theshan who had spent 11 years on a research exchange with human scientists, sent a report that was later marked urgent and circulated to the full council. It read in part, "They are not grieving, they are not regrouping. I have watched humans grieve, it is loud and physical and honest. This is something else. They are building toward a horizon I cannot see, and they seem to find the work deeply satisfying. They do not appear to miss us." That last sentence was underlined by 3 different counselors when the report circulated. It was the sentence no one quite knew what to do with. Because the council had spent considerable time over 400 years cataloging and managing species' emotions. Grief, pride, aggression, longing, they had frameworks for all of it. But contentment in the aftermath of exile, industry without audience, a species that had been publicly humiliated on the galactic stage and responded by going home and getting on with it. That was not in the literature. That had not been modeled. And somewhere in the deep architecture of the council's collective unease, a small structural crack had begun to form. Hairline nearly invisible, the kind that doesn't look like anything until the weight above it shifts. 6 months after the vote, Councillor Dresch of the Veth Consortium received a report from their logistics ministry that she read 3 times before she believed it. Then she called the ministry director and made him explain it aloud, because she needed to hear it in a voice, not see it in numbers on a screen. 34% of the Veth Consortium's supply chain had routed through human-operated jump relay stations. It was not a figure anyone had ever calculated before because no one had ever needed to. The relays had simply been there, the way gravity is simply there, ubiquitous, reliable, unremarkable. Human engineers had built them, human technicians had maintained them, and the fees had been modest enough that the Veth had never looked closely at what was actually running through those corridors of bent space. Now those stations were closed to Veth traffic. Not destroyed, human, to their credit, had not damaged the infrastructure. They had simply locked the doors. Rerouting was theoretically possible. The word theoretically was doing a great deal of work in that sentence. Alternate paths existed, but they added 3 to 7 weeks to transit times and required passing through Sulhari territorial space, and the Sulhari charged rates that the Veth ministry described as aggressive, and that Dresch privately described as extortionate. The Veth were not alone. They were simply the first to file a formal internal report, because Veth bureaucracy was efficient, and their ministry directors were paid to notice problems before those problems became crises. Across the council species, the same quiet hemorrhage was happening in 100 different forms. The Ulari Collective, who had submitted 40 pages cataloging humanity's ecological failures, were watching their coastal population centers struggle with a viral outbreak that had been, for 11 years, quietly managed by human xenobiologists embedded in a joint research station on Ulari's 4th continent. The xenobiologists had left with their equipment and their data 6 months ago. They had submitted no complaint. They had handed over what documentation they were contractually required to leave, packed their personal effects, and departed. The Ulari Medical Authority had assumed the research program was complete and had not looked closely at the maintenance protocols left behind. They were now looking very closely at those protocols and finding, to their growing distress, that several of them required a specific class of synthetic compound that only 3 facilities in the galaxy produced, 2 of which were human-operated. On the Mirhan frontier worlds, 17 weather monitoring satellites that had been jointly operated began returning degraded data. The human half of the operational software had not been sabotaged. It had simply stopped receiving its license renewal pings and had, per its own maintenance code, entered a minimal function state. The Mirhan technicians who attempted to update the software found it was written in a human development framework that none of their engineers had been trained on, because there had never been any reason to train them. Humans had always been there to run it. A junior analyst in the Council's own infrastructure bureau submitted a memo that week that was initially dismissed as alarmist. It was titled, Preliminary Assessment of Human Adjacent Dependencies Across Core Council Infrastructure, a First Pass. It ran to 212 pages and covered only the systems the analyst had managed to identify in a 6-week personal review. The analyst noted, at the close of the document, that she estimated this represented perhaps 15% of the total human footprint in council systems, and that she had stopped writing not because she had finished, but because she had run out of time. The memo was dismissed, but it was also saved, and in the weeks that followed, certain councilors began reading it at night, quietly, in the way people read things they hope are wrong but fear are true. It was a Veth scholar named Korath who first put the feeling into words, though he spent several months not writing them down because he suspected the council would not want to hear them. Korath had spent 30 years studying Earth cultures, not the military history, which was what most alien academics gravitated to when studying humans, but the quieter things. The food, the music structures, the peculiar human habit of making art out of their own suffering and then sharing it freely as though pain were a gift rather than a liability. He had made 3 research exchanges to human stations before the vote. He had colleagues there, not diplomatic contacts, but genuine colleagues, people who sent him papers they were excited about and argued with him about methodology, and occasionally sent him photographs of landscapes with no academic purpose whatsoever, just because the light had been interesting that morning. Those channels were closed now. He wrote the paper anyway. He titled it after several revisions, Did We Notice We Relied on Them? It was, by academic standards, a modest document, 40 pages, carefully sourced, deliberately restrained in its conclusions. It asked one central question, whether the Council's relationship with humanity had been so thoroughly normalized that it had become, functionally, invisible, and whether that invisibility was now costing something that had not yet been properly named. The Council's Academic Review Board dismissed it within 2 weeks of submission. The dismissal letter cited insufficient empirical grounding and speculative framing. Korath accepted this because he had expected it and posted the paper to the open academic network without comment. It was downloaded 11 million times in the first week. By the end of the month, it had been translated into 43 languages, including 6 human ones, distributed by humans who somehow had access to the network and were, apparently, reading it with great interest. But it was not the academic response that most unsettled the Council when they were finally forced to acknowledge it. It was what was happening in the spaces the paper did not cover, the cultural spaces, the daily life spaces, the places where policy did not reach. A black market for human goods had emerged, not weapons, not technology with military application. Food, music, specifically, human music, which had for decades been the most widely listened to non-native art form across 9 of the 17 council species, and which was now no longer being produced for external distribution. Human culinary ingredients, which had quietly become integrated into the food cultures of a dozen species who had never noticed it happening. Human fiction, which translated badly, but had always been downloaded anyway by beings who found in its strange emotional violence something they could not articulate, but could not stop seeking. Young Mirhan, who had grown up watching human entertainment streams, loud, chaotic, overstuffed with feeling, were forming study groups not to analyze the content academically, but simply to rewatch it together, because the new streams did not feel the same. Young Ulari scientists who had trained alongside human peers on exchange programs wrote letters to their institutions requesting any contact information that might still be functional. The institutions had none. The Council received a petition, signed by 4 million Veth citizens, requesting the restoration of trade access to human-operated relay stations. The petition was politely noted and filed. A second petition arrived 8 weeks later, this one signed by 7 million, including 12 sitting Veth regional governors. This one was less politely worded. Councillor Dresch, reading the second petition, thought about something her logistics director had said in their meeting 6 months earlier, almost as an aside. The extraordinary thing, Councillor, is that they never told us they were doing any of this. They just did it, and we just let them, and now they are gone. She had not known what to do with that sentence at the time. She was beginning to understand it now. The leak, when it came, did not come from a whistleblower or a disgruntled analyst or a political operative with an agenda. It came from a council archivist 3 days from retirement who had spent 40 years maintaining the classified intelligence repository, and who had, in those 4 decades, developed strong opinions about what information belonged to the people it concerned. She released 7 documents. She did not explain herself. She posted them to 6 different network nodes simultaneously, then went home, made dinner, and apparently slept soundly. By the time the council's security apparatus had identified the breach, the documents had been copied and redistributed by approximately 4 million separate actors across the Galactic network. Containment was charitably theoretical. The documents covered the human presence in the Galactic community over the preceding 2 centuries, not the diplomatic history. That was public. What these documents covered was everything that had happened beneath and around the diplomatic history, in the corridors where cameras did not point, and where formal agreements were never filed because both parties had found it more efficient to simply proceed without one. It turned out that human negotiators had, for approximately 80 years, been brokering shadow agreements between feuding council members. Agreements that never appeared in official records, because they resolved disputes before those disputes reached the stage of official records. 17 border conflicts that the Council's public history described as resolved through diplomatic process had been resolved because a human mediator had spent months embedded with both parties, unpaid, on personal leave, operating entirely outside their official capacity. The Ketzelhari resource dispute of 2287, which had been 6 weeks from becoming the first interspecies armed conflict in Council history, had been diffused by a human woman named Dr. Amma Ajay, who had no diplomatic credentials whatsoever. She was a geologist, on a research exchange, who had recognized what was happening and had simply started talking to people. Both species had later agreed, in separate private communications that were now in the leaked documents, that Ajay had understood their positions better than their own negotiating teams had. The infrastructure revelations were worse. Human engineers had, over the course of 6 decades, taken on the maintenance of 17 critical council systems, life support on joint stations, navigational arrays in contested space, medical fabrication networks on frontier worlds, because they were available, because they were good at it, and because no one else had stepped forward. None of this had been formalized. It had simply accumulated, the way important things often do. One task at a time, one favor at a time, until the favors had become the load-bearing walls of the structure. But it was the third category that produced the silence that lasted 4 days in the council chamber after the documents were officially acknowledged. Because the third set of documents, the ones with the highest classification level, the ones the archivist had clearly saved for last, covered what had been happening in the unmapped outer territories. The places past the frontier that the council had officially designated as unexplored and had, in practical terms, agreed without discussion to ignore. Humans had not ignored them. For 63 years, rotating crews of human military and exploratory vessels had been operating in those territories in what the documents described with bureaucratic understatement as preemptive risk management. What they had been managing, what they had been quietly holding back, containing, redirecting, and on 4 separate occasions engaging in direct combat against, were things the Council's oldest species recognized. Things their histories described. Things their ancestors had encountered at the edges of explored space before the Accord was established, and which had been, for centuries, simply not encountered again. The Council had assumed that absence meant gone. Humanity had apparently suspected otherwise, and had said nothing, and had gone to check, and had been keeping the results of that check to themselves for the better part of a century. There was a word for what the Council felt in those 4 days of silence. The Mirhan had it, buried in an archaic register of their language, a word for the specific sensation of standing in a room and realizing that someone else had been holding the walls up this entire time, and that you had never once looked to see whose hands were doing ITHE signal came from a relay station on the outer edge of mapped space, one of the few that had been jointly operated and had not yet been officially handed back, because the paperwork was still processing. A Mirhan communications officer named Vel was on duty when it arrived, and Vel was competent and experienced and had worked border signals for 11 years, and even Vel did not immediately understand what the signal was. It was not a transmission, it was a pattern. Specifically, A pattern of interference spread across 17 frequency bands simultaneously, moving in a way that was not random and was not any known form of pulsar emission or stellar activity. It was moving in a way that could only be described, Vell wrote in the incident report, visible reluctance and purposeful. The report reached the Council's Deep Space Monitoring Bureau within 6 hours, was escalated to the Intelligence Directorate within 12, and on the desks of senior counselors within 20. What happened next? The speed of the response. The faces in the room finished the briefing, confirmed to who witnessed it that at least some members of the Council had already suspected something like this was possible, that the documents had not entirely surprised them. The oldest member of the Council, Larry Elder the same session who had report initiation the same genetic as Larry Custom. Session primer serving on the Council for 50 years. Briefing included the room for their response, as it always did. Priority's institutional memory was effectively the Council's long-term. What is this? Image remembers what that means. We have not heard it in 400 years. 400 years ago, and we were grateful, and we did not ask why it stopped. The chamber went quiet in a way it had not been quiet since Yara Chen's footsteps had faded from it 14 months before. In the subsequent emergency sessions, the Council drafted plans. Of course they did. They were a governing body, and drafting plans was what governing bodies did in the face of threats, even threats they could not fully see yet. The plans were thorough. The plans were well-reasoned. The plans kept hitting the same wall from 6 different directions, and the wall was always the same wall, and no one wanted to say what the wall was made of. The Veth Consortium had the largest standing military fleet in the Council, and their analysts ran the engagement models until the analysts were no longer willing to run them, because the models kept producing the same outputs. Veth fleet doctrine was built on formation discipline and coordinated overwhelming force, concepts that worked magnificently against opponents who behaved in ways that could be modeled. The things in the outer dark did not behave in ways that could be modeled. They had been engaged, the leaked documents indicated, 4 times in 60 years, and each engagement had been resolved not through superior force, but through something the human military reports described with characteristic bluntness, as improvised tactical creativity under conditions of high uncertainty. The Ulari had the most sophisticated long-range detection systems. They could see the thing better than anyone. Seeing it more clearly had not made the analysts happier. The Mirhin had the fastest vessels. Fast enough to run, one general noted, and then looked at the floor. It was a young Veth military attaché who finally said it. She was 3 years out of her officer training, and she said it with the specific courage of someone who does not yet fully understand the weight of what she is saying. The humans knew this was coming. They'd been watching it. They had protocols. We voted them out, and we took none of the protocols, and now we need them back. The room did not agree with her out loud. It did not need to. The agreement was visible in the particular stillness that settled over 17 species at once, each of them doing the private arithmetic of pride and necessity, each of them arriving at the same answer at slightly different speeds, each of them waiting for someone else to say it first. The delegation that traveled to human space was the largest the Council had ever assembled for a single diplomatic mission. 16 senior representatives, support staff. 3 heads of state who had never left their home systems before, and an honor guard that had been argued over for 6 sessions before someone pointed out that an honor guard was perhaps not the correct framing for a mission that was, functionally, an apology. The honor guard was replaced with a small team of archivists tasked with documenting the proceedings. The archivists noted, in their preliminary report, that the delegation's ships were required to travel the long route to human space, through Sulhari territory, adding 19 days to the journey, because the human-operated relay stations that would have shortened the trip were not accepting Council vessels. The Council had been politely and briefly informed of this when they filed their transit request. No explanation was offered, none was required. What the delegation found at the edge of human space was not what they had expected. They had expected, at some level, to find what any species looked like after 15 months of isolation following a public humiliation, something wounded or rebuilding or bravely pretending to be fine. They found none of those things. What they found was the Helix Station, which had not existed 15 months ago and which was now, by the Council's own engineering assessments, one of the 7 largest constructed objects in known space. It hung above Jupiter in a configuration that human architects had apparently designed in the first 3 weeks after the withdrawal, and then built with a speed that the delegation's engineers found genuinely difficult to categorize. Not rushed, nothing about it looked rushed. Accelerated. As though the blueprint had been waiting somewhere, and simply needed permission to become real. The station was not a refuge. It was not a fortress. It was a civilization's infrastructure made visible: trade hubs, research centers, educational facilities, medical fabrication plants, and at its core, a diplomatic chamber that seated 140 and had been furnished, the delegation noted, with chairs designed for 17 different species physiologies. Ambassador Yara Chen received them in a smaller room. She had not brought aides. She was wearing the same composed expression that 17 species had seen on the news feeds the day she walked out of the Grand Chamber, as though the expression had simply been waiting, folded, until it was needed again. The Council's lead representative, the Mirhin speaker Orathvil, had prepared a speech. He delivered the first 3 paragraphs of it: the acknowledgement of error, the formal retraction of the censure motion, the expression of sincere regret, and then stopped because Chen had raised one hand not to interrupt but to indicate that the speech was not necessary. "I know what you need," she said. "You need help with whatever is coming from the outer dark. You know that we know what it is. And you've done the math, and you need our people's specific way of thinking about a problem like this, which cannot be replicated on short notice." She paused. "What I need to know from you is whether you understand why we are the way we are." Orathvil looked at her for a long moment. The Council had spent 400 years classifying human emotional volatility as a liability. The woman in front of him was exhibiting none of it. She was exhibiting something the Mirhin emotional lexicon categorized as lethoravan, the stillness of a person who has already decided their own worth and found it sufficient. "We are beginning to," Orathvil said. It was, for a politician of his experience, an extraordinarily honest answer. Chen nodded slowly. "Then we have something to discuss." She gestured toward the window, toward Jupiter's cloud bands rolling in slow, ancient patterns below them. "We've been thinking about a better structure, not the one you had, something that doesn't assume the loudest voice knows the most." She let that sit for a moment. "We'd like to show it to you." Outside, beyond the station's observation windows, 17 human vessels had appeared in quiet formation, not a display of military power, but a presence calm and patient. They had been there for the entirety of the meeting. No one on the delegation had been informed they would be there. They had simply arrived, the way important things had always arrived when humanity was involved. Without announcement, already in position, already waiting to begin. The negotiations lasted 9 days. They were not the negotiations the Council had come prepared for. The Council's legal team had arrived with 6 frameworks for reintegration: graduated membership tiers, provisional reinstatement structures, a carefully designed pathway back to the seat that humanity had vacated. They had spent 3 months developing these frameworks, and they were, by any measure, excellent documents. Yara Chen read all 6 of them overnight on the first day. She returned them the next morning with 17 pages of annotations. Most of the annotations were questions. A few were corrections of factual errors. One, in the margin of Framework 3, was a single sentence that the Council's legal lead read 4 times before fully absorbing. "These are frameworks for restoring what was. We're not interested in what was." What humanity proposed instead was not a return. It was a replacement, not of the Council itself, but of the principle on which it operated, the unspoken assumption that had run beneath 400 years of galactic governance like a fault line, so deep and so old that no one had thought to examine it. The old Council had organized itself around the concept of civilization, defined primarily by what a species had stopped doing. Had it stopped making war, stopped consuming its own biosphere, stopped behaving in ways that more established species found uncomfortable? It was, humanity's proposed framework noted with characteristic bluntness, a system that rewarded conformity and penalized novelty, and had systematically excluded the kinds of minds that were most useful precisely when things became strange and dangerous. The new framework was called, in the official documentation, the Compact of Mutual Survival. In practice, everyone simply called it the Compact, and later historians would call it the turning point, the moment when galactic governance stopped being a club and started being a coalition. Contribution replaced conformity. Capacity was recognized before culture. A species' history of violence was not erased from consideration, but was weighed against what that same history had produced. The resilience, the adaptability, the deep-wired stubbornness that made humans specifically, and perhaps uniquely, useful in precisely the situations the old council framework had least prepared anyone for. Humanity returned, not to the seat they had left. That seat was retired along with the table it had been part of. They took a different seat in a different chamber around a different table that had been designed. The delegation's head of protocol observed to have no obvious head. Every seat was equidistant from the center. Every seat had the same sightlines to every other seat. It was, he thought, an extraordinarily small detail that carried an extraordinarily large meaning. The thing from the outer dark was engaged in the 43rd day after the compact was formally ratified. The operation was not led by the council. It was not led by any single species. It was coordinated, organized with the kind of fluid, improvisational precision that the Veth military attaché had read about in classified documents and had not entirely believed until she watched it happen in real time. Human tactical officers communicated with Veth fleet commanders in a shorthand that had apparently developed during 60 years of joint operations. No one had officially acknowledged. Mirhan pilots flew cover on geometries that human navigators had calculated, and that the Mirhan themselves admitted they would not have conceived of independently. Ulari medical teams worked from protocols designed partly by human xenobiologists who had been, formally, out of the system for 15 months, and had apparently spent that time refining the protocols. It was over in 9 hours. The outer dark went quiet again. It would not stay quiet forever. Everyone understood this. It never had. But it was quiet today, and quiet today was what mattered. In the aftermath, a historian named Velkorath, a Mirhan-Veth academic collaboration, an institution that had not existed 2 years earlier, began writing the definitive account of what the period had come to be called, the Long Silence. The account would take 6 years to complete and would be read by more beings than any document in the history of the compact. Its opening line, debated and revised and finally kept exactly as Velkorath had first written it, read, "We mistook their silence for surrender. It was, in fact, the sound of them deciding whether we were worth saving. The extraordinary thing, the thing that should inform every governance decision made in the centuries to come, is that they decided we were, not because we had earned it, because they had chosen to be the kind of people who save things." Somewhere in the archives, an old glass sat on a shelf in the diplomatic museum on the Helix station. Just a glass. The kind you might find in any meeting room in any civilization in the galaxy. A small placard beside it explained, for visitors who asked, that it had once held water, in a chamber where one voice went quiet so that something larger could eventually be said. Most visitors didn't understand why it was there. The ones who had been in the room on that day never needed the placard explained.